Welcome, Shrewsbury First Assembly. Pastor Tim Harris here. And over these next 40 days leading up to Easter, we're reading through a Bible reading entitled The Big Story, The Big Story. And this story that we're going to be looking at as we go through the highlights of Scripture is really God's story. It's His story. It's the story of how God has worked in our world to demonstrate His love to us. It's the story of how God has worked to bring us into relationship with Him. This big story, it all leads up to Jesus. It all flows out of Jesus, because ultimately it's through Jesus that we become a part of the big story of God's story. So I trust as we go through these 40 days of reading that this will be a blessing to you, and every few days or so I'll be coming back on with some thoughts regarding our reading for that day. And so today's reading begins with Genesis chapters 1 and 2 as we look at the account of creation. And as I look at this, and we're reading Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." He goes on to say that the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And yet God began to speak. God began to create. So I'm reminded this morning as I read that everything begins and ends with God. That in the beginning, God, that we would not be here and our world would not be here except that God stepped in. God created our world. God created us on purpose and for a purpose. We see how God steps into the darkness and the chaos that was our world at that time, if you can call it that. He steps into that darkness and He begins to create, saying, "Let there be light, and let there be day and night, and the waters and the trees and the animals and the birds." And at each step of the way, He looks at creation and He says, "It is good." And eventually He reaches down to the dust of the earth. Think of it, the dirt of the earth. And He, out of that dirt, out of that dust, He creates mankind. He creates humanity. And when He looks at the human beings, at Adam and Eve, He says, not just "it is good," but "it is very good." You see, our world and our lives are meant to be a reflection of God's goodness. As God created, He didn't create anything bad, but He created that which is good. And again, our world and our lives are meant to reflect that goodness. Now, I know it doesn't always feel that way as we look at our world and as we look at our lives. Sometimes we feel like we're being plunged into darkness. Maybe some things have happened in your life that have sent you spinning into some sort of chaos or despair. But I want to remind you that He is still a God who's able to step into the darkest parts of our lives and still bring about something that is good. In the book of Ecclesiastes, we read that He makes all things beautiful in His time. And the Apostle Paul tells us that God works all things together for the good of those who love Him and who are called according to His purpose. So let's trust Him today. Let's believe that He's able to step into our world and into our lives and still bring about something that is good, something that is very good. Well, God bless you and have a great day. Let's keep on reading the big story.